Elden Ring. So close, yet so far. Counting down the weeks to your arrival is a special kind of pain. But I know when you arrive, that pain of agonizing boredom and anticipation will be replaced with the pain of what can only be described as video game-induced cock and ball torture. I imagine the experience will go something like this. I'll start the game up, create a character, have a good time. It'll all be easy sailing until I reach that first difficult boss. I'll die probably 50 times against them, end up smashing my controller against the wall, go drown my sorrows in a couple of Girls' Way videos, and then finally return to the game only to die for another 4 hours. But what if I didn't have to die? What if there was another way? What if the bosses were easier? Can it be true? Does such a concept exist? Have I gone beyond the realms of plausibility in video games? No. It's called an easy mode. And apparently, it's a pretty saucy topic in the gaming community these days, and I'm nothing if not saucy, so why not talk about it? Hey everybody, it's your boy, motherfucking Spa. Now, I know I'm a pretty small cock in the locker room of other internet personalities that have come out with their opinion on difficulty modes, and more specifically easy modes in FromSoft games, but I thought it'd be fun for me to force myself back into the video creation scene and give my take as well. I'm hoping this video doesn't receive too much shit, but this conversation is pretty fucking wild on the internet these days, so hey, if you've got an opposing opinion, feel free to comment that shit, and I'll see if you can't change my mind. Now, before we jump into this whole idea of whether or not Souls games need difficulty options included in them, I think it's important to separate the concept of difficulty options and accessibility options, because these two things get conflated a lot in this discussion from what I've seen, and I don't consider them to be the same. When I think of difficulty options, I think of things like easy modes, and hard modes, and really hard modes, rock hard modes, and diamond modes. And when I think of accessibility options, I think of things like colorblind modes and options that allow you to change button mapping or connect to specialty controllers that are easier for some individuals to use. I think these options are sometimes seen as interchangeable because, in a sense, both do technically lower the difficulty bar for individuals to beat these games, so they get lumped together in these discussions. But there's a pretty big distinction between the two. If I'm trying to complete a puzzle, for example, with like 200 pieces in the box, there's a pretty big difference between me not being able to solve the puzzle because I'm a dumb fuck, and me not being able to solve the puzzle because I don't have arms. I think that's probably the best analogy I can give for distinguishing between these two topics. Difficulty modes address a skill deficiency, whereas accessibility modes are catered toward solving a physical incompatibility. I think the point of accessibility modes are to make it so that less abled gamers are able to interact with games to a similar, if not equal degree as non-disabled gamers. I know for a fact I've seen people online defend the idea that Souls games don't need difficulty options, and that results in accusations of ableism, but honestly, this argument is really fucking stupid. Not only is it not really relevant to what the actual discussion is about, but it's also pretty fucking cringe to act like disabled gamers aren't capable of handling difficult games. The problem isn't that disabled gamers lack the skill to complete these games, it's that they lack the ability to interact with the game in a way that makes the challenge fair to begin with. Now, this topic gets into a whole side discussion about what disabilities are being addressed in the gaming industry, which ones aren't, how you choose which ones you should address and which ones you shouldn't, the level of responsibility a game company or developer holds to cater to these disabled groups, etc. I am not the person to have any of these discussions with, because, quite frankly, I don't know enough about the subject. As a general rule, I think accessibility options are a positive thing, and the gaming industry should make including these options the standard to reach for going forward. On the other hand, however, I do recognize there is a cost-benefit analysis that goes into designing things like this, and it's never as black and white as simply making all games have accessibility options, because each game is going to have its own unique accessibility issues that accompany it depending on what the game even is and how it's played. Basically, all this is to say, I think they're definitely a good thing, and all I can do is hope that as our technology improves, gaming becomes a more accessible form of entertainment for everyone. So now on to the main point and the reason you probably clicked on this video. Do FromSoft games need difficulty options? The harsh truth of the matter is, they absolutely do. And if you think otherwise, you're an ableist piece of shit. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you were able to come away with this with some newfound knowledge on this issue. And I'll see you guys in my next video coming out in 2025. Nah, guys. Nah, guys. I was joking the whole. That was a joke. That was a good one. Did I get you? Comment below if I got you. I bet I got you. Of course, they don't need difficulty options. But the problem is this isn't really a fair way to frame this question, right? The games don't need difficulty options any more than I need a big titty smacker GF. These aren't needs. You aren't going to find these bad boys on Maslow's pyramid. Believe me, I checked. The question then should actually be, would it be a bad thing for these games to have difficulty options? And honestly, this is where I think I'm going to lose some of you. While personally, I think it's really pathetic to go on Twitter and scream and moan about how Dark Souls games need difficulty options and how FromSoft isn't respecting their fan base or gamers at large or whatever by implementing them, I think it's equally pathetic for the fanboys to respond with such vitriol against the idea of adding difficulty options. Nobody likes a centrist, but that's where I'm at on this discussion. I really don't think it's a problem either way, and so far none of the arguments I've seen have been able to convince me otherwise. I think it's 100% fine if Dark Souls and other From games stay the same as they've been since Demon Souls, but I also think it's equally fine if the games start putting in difficulty options for players to choose between. I know this isn't addressed commonly when this topic is brought up, or at least in my experience it isn't, but FromSoft has already implemented difficulty options in their games before and nobody had issues with them. And no, I'm not talking about player-modulated difficulty, I'm talking straight-up difficulty modes that are built into these games. If you're not aware of what I'm talking about, I'm referring to Dark Souls 2's Company of Champions Covenant and Sekiro's Demon Bell mechanic. In Dark Souls 2, you have the option to opt into a covenant at the start of the game that lowers your damage by 20% and increases damage taken by 33%. This is a flat rate applied to all PvE aspects of the game. Over in Sekiro, the Demon Bell is a similar mechanic that when rung gives enemies higher vitality damage, higher posture damage, higher vitality damage resistance, and higher posture damage resistance. These are undeniably difficulty options, and not like player-modulated difficulty options that Souls fans like to talk about these games using. These are flat-out hard modes in every single way but their name. The lack of a title of a hard mode doesn't make these not hard modes. I don't know what else people could possibly consider them to be. And the weird thing is, nobody complains about them. I think a lot of people that argue against difficulty options in Souls games forget that this actually already exists, and it's not really a problem in either game. People can either choose to implement it or choose to not. Your choice to beat the game with the Demon Bell on doesn't really impact my playthrough of the game with the Demon Bell off, and vice versa. I think these examples go to show just how harmless these alternate modes actually are in practice. I recently got into a debate about difficulty modes in FromSoft games, and that's kind of what prompted me to make this video to begin with, and I think the arguments the person made are relatively representative of the arguments a lot of people in the Dark Souls community make. The problem is I just don't think any of those arguments hold up to closer scrutiny. They'll say things like, why would one ever trade a traditional difficulty slider in place of all these creative, well-thought-out in-game options, referring to, again, player-modulated difficulty through things like weapon selection and loadout and summoning, all those aspects of the game. But there's no rule that having one eradicates the other. You can have both of these things, and we already do. Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro prove this. No one is trading away the player-modulated difficulty aspects. In Dark Souls 2, implementing the Company of Champions Covenant didn't stop players from still running challenge builds or using in-game options to tweak the difficulty. It's the same with Sekiro. Adding the Demon Bell doesn't mean you suddenly can't do runs without certain prosthetics or no skill upgrade runs or whatever else you choose to do to modulate the difficulty in-game. I understand that perhaps an adjacent argument to this would be, well, why have standard difficulty options when the player-modulated options already exist and work just fine? But my question back would just be, why not? Is there any actual harm in including both? And please remember, when I say this, I'm not trying to push for standard difficulty options to be put into these games. I'm just questioning what the problem would be if they actually decided to do so. What does it take away if player-modulated difficulty still exists alongside more traditional difficulty options? I don't even think it'd be possible to take player-modulated difficulty out unless they fundamentally changed every single aspect of customization in these games, which seems very unlikely. I want to make sure I frame this the right way too, because another point that maybe scares some people is how they would go about designing these difficulty modes. I think there's a fear that the design focus of the games would shift to the easy mode as opposed to the standard difficulty that FromSoft fans are used to at this point. I'm just going to come out and say, this fear seems entirely unfounded, and again, we can look to Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro to see this. It seems fairly obvious in those games that the base game itself is the intended difficulty that gets designed for and around and catered towards in the development period, and afterwards, easy and hard modes, if included, would simply work as some kind of in-game mechanic that applies a flat buff or debuff to yourself and enemies in a way that makes the games either easier or harder. Instead of a Company of Champions covenant, think the Company of Pussies covenant. And instead of a demon bell, maybe there's a saint bell or something along those lines. I haven't exactly given the names a whole lot of thought, but obviously the important thing is the mechanic itself, not what we call them. Oh, and another quick note is that some people get really bent out of shape about this idea of like a generic difficulty selector in these games for whatever reason, but it doesn't have to function in this way. Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro both had optional hard modes that didn't use a difficulty selection screen. You can tie these options to in-game mechanics that feel more organic than just outright asking the player to choose their difficulty. So that problem is easily avoidable, and it's already been avoided in the past. I think the fact that these modes are almost never addressed when this topic comes up is proof that this issue, if you consider it to be an issue, isn't really an issue. Next, people like to go to points like, well, how would they design the game around this? So many things would have to be changed to make this work, like enemy placement and online functionality. For starters, you don't have to change enemy placement, or their weapons, or their movesets, or anything of that sort to do an easy mode. The only changes Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro made to their hard modes were just buffs to how much damage enemies did and debuffs to how much damage they received. Enemy placements didn't have to be changed, none of their weapons had to be altered, everything stayed the same except the damage. Moving on to things like online functionality, I think this argument might come from a place of fear that the online mechanics will be scrapped in their entirety because FromSoft can't figure out a way to make it work across all the difficulty modes, so they just don't design it for any of the modes. But once again, we can look to Dark Souls 2, which already kind of solved this. You can have the multiplayer aspects, they'll just be limited to NPC co-op and invasions. Here's how I imagine it would work. Normal co-op would be designed around players who play the standard mode. Easy mode players wouldn't be able to summon or co-op with these people. Same for hard mode, I guess, but we're focusing on easy mode right now. However, they would be allowed to summon co-op NPCs and invader NPCs throughout the game like normal. These NPCs are still technically PvE elements, just masquerading as online ones, so they can easily be buffed or debuffed based on the difficulty mode, the same as any other PvE aspect. And this doesn't take away the mechanic from those players. If multiplayer aspects like co-op and invasions are somehow pertinent to the plot or overarching narrative, they still exist, just in a restricted form. And while I can already hear the rebuttal about how that's not the true multiplayer experience, do you really think it's that big of a deal? What about people who don't pay for online subscriptions to Sony and Microsoft who can't do multiplayer, or the people without reliable Wi-Fi like myself who generally just turn it off? What about people who just don't really give two fucks about multiplayer aspects of Souls games? I said this in my Dark Souls 2 video, but it bears repeating. Dark Souls games, and by extension FromSoft games, are PvE experiences first and foremost, with tacked-on multiplayer components. If people honestly feel that multiplayer is such an important component to these games, why aren't people advocating that FromSoft makes the game entirely online-based, so that you can't even play it unless you're logged into a server or something? I think there's actually a lot of different potential ways they could go about implementing co-op in PvP that works even across the different difficulties in the game, but let's assume for a moment that FromSoft decides, you know what, we're not allowing anyone who chooses the hard mode or easy mode to do PvP or co-op. They can use the NPCs that serve this role in game, but actually connecting to the server is only used for the base game that we designed around. If they did this, I still don't see how it would even be a problem. Players would just have to choose. It's a trade-off that the player selecting the difficulty mode would have to understand and justify whether or not that lack of online interaction is worth the experience they're opting into. And probably more important to the people who argue this point, it doesn't impact the experience that you would be opting into, which I'm assuming would be the base or standard mode that the game is intended to be played at, so you're not actually losing anything through the inclusion of difficulty modes. I saw that last point about NPCs in an Actman video as well, which got released not too long ago about this very topic, and there were a few more arguments I disagree with that he made. Now, I'm not going to do a point-by-point analysis of his videos. I don't actually disagree with everything he says, but the points I don't disagree with also don't contradict any of my positions. His video will be linked in the description for those of you who want to see his entire perspective. He brings up the whole invasions and co-op aspect of these games, but I already addressed that general argument. So next he mentions covenants and how those would no longer work, and not only would they not work, but you'd be cutting out content from the story as well for those players because covenants are generally tied into the lore somehow.
Oh hey, you mind telling me how covenants are gonna work now? Because those are relying on PvP. You talk about how much you want to experience the story, but now we're cutting chunks of that out too. So now we're in a situation where you either cut out the PvP entirely, or you keep it and you let people in the easy mode get absolutely destroyed. It's apparent to anyone who's actually played these games that if you sit down and try to think through the logistics of an easy mode, in 5 minutes you should realize what an absolute disaster it would be. But people asking for it haven't done that. Why are you so confident? You don't know what you're talking about.
The problem is, even if FromSoft did completely cut online aspects of covenants from players, you wouldn't actually be restricted from completing them any more than people who play offline are restricted from completing them. All the games with covenants have offline ways to earn the materials that are used to rank up in said covenants. It takes a long ass time to do it, but it's still there. Again, it's a trade-off the player would have to make. This is something the player is going to do regardless. You make trade-offs in these games all the time. You can't be the best sorcerer and the best physical tank in the game at the same time. You generally have to either compromise or pick between the two. You can't be in every covenant at the same time and reap all the benefits of each one simultaneously. You have to choose one at a time. And again, it's not like it'd be impossible to make the co-op and PvP work across the different difficulties if they really wanted to. For co-op, just have the players operate on the difficulty setting of the summoner. Does that mean someone who's used to fighting on the easy difficulty might get summoned into a world that uses the hard difficulty? Sure does, but that's a risk you take when engaging in the online function. And for PvP, I don't think anything would have to change from the games as they are right now. Players aren't PvE, so they shouldn't have their damage or their damage resistance scaled in any way. That means no matter what option you choose, PvP is equal for everyone. If the easy mode players don't like that, they don't have to do PvP. I guess the final argument I want to address in this video is the idea that FromSoft games are designed around tough but fair encounters, and it takes away from the game if you make these challenges easier for players to overcome. Miyazaki wants people to experience a challenge that leaves them feeling satisfied after fighting it, and that's why difficulty options shouldn't be added, because it takes away from that challenge, and that takes away from the experience, which is central to the ideology behind the Souls games. The Actman, again, kind of parrots this argument, and he adds in a couple more points to it as well, so I'd like to play a clip from his video to add his argument into the mix.
In easy mode betrays the very tone and atmosphere that FromSoftware is aiming to establish. One of oppressive circumstances and a weak character battling against the odds. That's where the satisfaction and joy comes from, conquering those challenges. Which is why the designers often put you up against a tough boss at the beginning. Death and failure are part of the gameplay, but they're also intrinsic to the story. It's literally in the title of Sekiro.
The problem I have with what's being said here is that if these points apply to an easy mode, they also apply to everyone who's simply good at FromSoftware games. I don't want to suck my dick too hard here, but at this point in my life, I'm really fucking good at Souls games. The PvE, at least. If you give me a Souls game and I'm running an average build, I'm not going to have any difficulties to overcome. I'm not going to die and have to triumph over any challenges. Nowadays, I'm more likely to die from shitty platforming than the difficult bosses in these games. And despite all this, I never feel like these games' tone or atmosphere is betrayed. I still find satisfaction and joy from playing the game despite no longer having any challenges standing in my way that need to be conquered. And while death is pertinent to the story in most FromSoftware games, it can still be conveyed to the player through other means. I think people place way too much weight on how much player death impacts things like the tone, atmosphere, and the story in these games. It has so much more to do with the characters you meet, their individual backstories, the world building, the lore you can uncover, the different locations you explore, and how all of these different things combine together to create the overall experience. These games can accomplish their intended story, tone, atmosphere, and whatever else without requiring me to die against each new enemy I encounter. I feel the same way about the whole "the challenge is where the sense of satisfaction and joy comes from" argument. I still experience these feelings when playing these games all these years later when the challenge has long since passed. And if there's anyone else watching this who still enjoys playing through these games even after you've mastered them, then you know what I'm talking about. Shifting the focus back to the level of challenge people experience again, another thing to consider is that everyone is going to be facing a different level of challenge due to their initial skill level, even when fighting the exact same thing as someone else. What's easy for me isn't going to be necessarily easy for someone else. If difficulty options were included, the literal challenge itself might be different, but the relative challenge for the player base as a whole would be more equivalent across the skill levels, if that makes any sense. And then players could opt into whatever level of challenge is best suited towards them, upping the ante as they continue to improve if they so choose. This sort of thing already happens all the time in Souls games. Like, most people don't start out a new Souls game doing a Soul Level 1 run. You first master the game's mechanics, and then you bump up the difficulty to accommodate your skill level. I seriously fail to see the difference between something like this and a newbie who sucks dick at the game playing Dark Souls for the first time by first mastering it on an easy mode, then going to the standard mode, and then doing some Soul Level 1 dickless run. It's kind of the same progression. Oh, and while we're on this topic, I'd like to address another thing I've heard about boss fights and easy difficulties. Here's an argument someone made to me while debating the idea of easy modes, and honestly, it just perplexes me. They argue, on one hand, that the feeling of overcoming that challenge of a boss you couldn't beat, or a really tough enemy or area, is the thing that hooks players on Souls games. But then they also say at the bottom that by adding an easy mode, people will just turn on that easy mode, avoid the challenge, and then swap back immediately after. They actually admit to doing this themselves, which is probably where the concern about this actually comes from. Responding first to the idea that other players might do this to themselves, who cares? It's their game, they can play it in whatever way they want. If they want to neuter their own experience by taking all the challenge of the game by swapping to an easy mode because they're too fucking weak-willed to push through a challenge, that's their problem, not yours. And by the way, they can already do this, guys. It is entirely possible to play through a Souls game exploiting things like magic and summons so that you never have to actually engage with the challenge. If there's a tough boss, just sit in the back and spam Soul Spear while 3 summons tank all the damage for you, or get those same summons to clear an entire level for you while you hide behind them. Now, I understand the typical response to this is, so why do you need a difficulty option if you can already do this? And again, I have to make myself perfectly clear, my point is not that we need difficulty options. That has never been my point. My point is that this response about how difficulty and overcoming challenge is the most important aspect of these games can already be circumvented by the mechanics in these games. I don't know if this makes me a consequentialist or whatever, but I don't understand why it's such a significant difference to people when you refuse to engage with the challenge by exploiting summons as opposed to avoiding challenge by using an easy mode. In fact, I would argue that summons have the potential to break these games far worse than any easy mode ever could. And then responding to the people who argue that all Souls players would do this in general, I completely disagree. How on earth can you claim that the thing that hooks you on a Souls game is the difficulty and overcoming that challenge is what makes these games so fun and addictive, while simultaneously saying that if the game is going to present a challenge to you, you're going to just immediately swap to easy mode, beat the challenge, and then turn on hard mode again? How can you be so passionate about this aspect of Souls games and then be such a pushover when the thing you're apparently so passionate about actually presents itself? I mean, there's a super easy solution to this issue as well. Just don't let players change difficulties. Once you select a difficulty, have the game not allow you to swap it. If you want to beat that boss, you gotta either push through or start a new file on an easier mode. Alternatively, make it so that you can only select down in terms of difficulty. Everyone could start out at the base game difficulty that the game is intended to be played at, right? But once you choose to activate a difficulty option, now the game doesn't allow you to re-alter it unless you're lowering the difficulty. So if you choose easy mode at the start of the game, you can't unchoose it. You're stuck there, and the game could be very explicit about this. Now if you choose hard mode instead of easy mode, you have the option to undo the hard mode, but once done, you can't reactivate it on that same file. You're now locked at normal mode. And you can still choose at any time to go from normal mode to easy mode, but once on easy mode, you're stuck there for good. This isn't a novel idea. This implementation of difficulty modes is used in plenty of other games, and the knowledge that you're unable to openly swap between difficulties at any given time would massively disincentivize people from changing their difficulty setting in a one-off moment of challenge. Ultimately, though, I don't even think either of those systems would be required. In Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro, you could swap between turning the challenge modes on and off as often as you liked, whenever you liked, and it was perfectly fine. The people who actually want the challenge are going to push through that challenge. Even when the going gets rough, they're going to keep on trucking. Kind of like a trucker gamer. Honk if you're gaming kind of meme. You know what I mean? I guess as a final point to address before this video is over, I know people are going to bring up that one quote Miyazaki made about not wanting to include different difficulty options in his games, and just as a response to that, this entire discussion is about a hypothetical future where Miyazaki changes his mind on this aspect. And the ironic thing about this quote is that it's from an interview leading up to Sekiro's release, but again, Miyazaki was the creative director for Sekiro, and Sekiro had difficulty options. They just weren't explicitly labeled hard and normal mode, so it almost seems like he's more receptive to the idea of difficulty modes than he lets on publicly. And this part about his concerns over fragmenting the user base is weird to me, just because even after the Demon Bell and Company of Champions were created, it didn't fragment or segment the user base. Or if it did, it's not any worse than it was before by the purists who already do this, saying things like how beating the game with magic isn't really beating the game legitimately, or anyone who beats a boss using summons hasn't truly beaten that boss, so on and so forth. These people already exist in the fanbase. And just as an aside, for those individuals who feel this way, this train of logic can be run back infinitely just to show that it's completely stupid to make statements about who qualifies as a true Souls fan or who qualifies as someone who's legitimately beaten the game as opposed to someone who's done it in a quote-unquote illegitimate way. Oh, you beat the game? That's cute, but it doesn't count until you do it without using summons. Oh, well, you beat the game without using summons? That's cute, but it doesn't count until you do it without using magic. Oh, well, you beat the game with no summons and no magic? That's cute, but it doesn't count until you do it at soul level 1. Oh, well, you beat the game at soul level 1? That's cute, but it doesn't count until it's new game plus 7. Oh, well, you beat it at soul level 1, new game plus 7? Well, that's cute, but it doesn't count until you do it fist only. Oh, well, you beat it at soul level 1, new game plus 7, fist only? Well, that's cute, but it doesn't count until you do all that while getting punched in the nuts every 10 seconds. I understand that people who make arguments like this would never go to this extreme, but the point of an extreme example is to show that the line of logic being used is just stupid in general. These people are just fucking gatekeeping. And everybody fucking hates hearing that in the Souls community, because it's an accusation that's lobbed against the community as a whole, and it's entirely due to this subgroup of people that won't shut the fuck up in these discussions. The notion that you need to beat these games within certain parameters while following certain regulations in order to be a true fan or in order to claim that you've truly beaten these games is so fucking stupid and such a waste of time. I need to remind all of you out there that feel this way. It's just a video game. It's supposed to be fun. Just let people play the game in a way that's fun for them. Stop telling people there's a right and wrong way to beat these games. Just let people play them in a way that's most enjoyable. To them. Yeah, that's a good one. If that means beating the game on New Game Plus 7 at Soul Level 1 fist only while suffering from Stage 4 testicular cancer, then that's fine. You can play that way. Nobody gives a fuck. It's not gatekeeping to enjoy a challenge in a game, or to enjoy discussing how to increase that challenge for yourself, or even taking pride in the fact that you overcame a self-imposed challenge, or any of these things. But it's absolutely gatekeeping when people start spreading these ideas that you aren't actually a member of a community or a group, or you're not allowed in the community or group, or whatever the fuck, because you didn't accomplish some task at some arbitrary level of difficulty. We as a Souls community need to come together and disavow these people. I feel like there's a decent amount of them who hold their views, but they're closeted and they won't come out unless something like an easy mode is introduced. So while I understand that this kind of mode could exacerbate the issue of segmenting the community, I don't know if that's actually a bad thing. If the community became fragmented in a way that we could finally identify these groups of people that unironically feel this way and publicly shame their ideas and call these idiots out, I think it would actually do a lot more good than harm. Maybe I'm wrong on that, who knows. I guess we'll only ever find out if they actually add easy modes, so unless that day comes, I guess we're all still gatekeepers according to Twitter. With that tangent out of the way, here's my final thesis statement to wrap this whole discussion up. Dark Souls and FromSoft games absolutely do not need easy modes. The people that demand they implement these options are obnoxious, self-entitled, and a general blight on the gaming community at large, and they will die a bunch of loser virgins. However, you are just as unfuckable if you react in a similar extreme manner to the idea of FromSoftware changing their mind going forward about implementing difficulty options. I feel like it's possible that a lot of people who enjoy these games that strongly oppose this kind of change are less concerned about actual damage being done to the series as much as they're concerned about the Twitter mob getting what they want. Now, FromSoft including difficulty options doesn't necessarily mean that they cave to public outcry or whatever. They could easily just decide that this is a new direction or mentality they have when creating these games, and the decision could be made completely independent of any public opinion. But optically, that would still be a win for the game journalists and the Twitter mob and the casuals or whatever the fuck you want to call them. I empathize with people that don't want to give them that win, but we have to remember that we can concede that an easy mode wouldn't be the worst thing in the world and still say that these people are in the wrong. Holding both positions isn't a contradiction. As a final note, I want to just reiterate my feelings on this subject just so that I'm super clear. I do not think that FromSoftware games need difficulty options. I also do not care if FromSoft games never add difficulty options. I'm perfectly fine with these games as they are now, and I think FromSoft has absolutely zero obligation to change the way they've been doing things up until this point. I completely respect Miyazaki and the development team's decision to make these games in whatever way they want. However, I also do not care at all if these games start implementing difficulty options, because it doesn't impact me in any way, shape, or form, and they've already shown in the past that they are both willing and capable of implementing difficulty options without fucking these games into the ground and ruining the experience. People can already avoid difficulty in these games by exploiting systems that completely eradicate the challenging experience that Souls fans are so horny about. So if they're gonna do that in the games that exist now, we might as well be open to the idea of gamers doing it through easy modes in the future. Thank you for coming to my TEDx talk. Now get the fuck out of my house. Motherfucking spa back baby! Yeah!